Dr. Siv Watkins, welcome aboard.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, good, good. You look like you're in heaven. You've got like backlighting going on. That's
How kind
really
of you
cool.
to notice. It's almost heaven. It's New Mexico, which is near as damn it for me.
No, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Well, I think we'll get to with that accent how you're there as we go through the show. But obviously, question number one, Siv, were you a weird kid?
Well, that's kind of relative, isn't it? But I imagine that most people would say I was a bit odd, which is a friendly way of putting it. I was very precocious and kind of obsessive, and I had a bit of a challenging upbringing. So the way that I became a microbiologist even is related to that. And I became a microbiologist when I was a very small child, but my parents are really cool people, very sort of hardy and earthy and working class British. And so things like we used to have a chicken dinner every Sunday, right? And when I was a kid, when you bought a whole chicken, it had the little plastic bag of giblets in it,
Sure.
sort of the innards. I don't know, I'm vegan now, so I don't know if that's
Right. You do still get it with turkeys, and I think if you get like fancy chickens,
fancy. All right,
like when I
good.
buy chickens from, which I only buy from my local butcher anyway, but like you can get them there. But you can't get, because I make, I use a lot of chicken liver, like making pate and things. That
Yeah.
takes a while to get, but yes. Anyway, the bag of giblets, carry on.
All right, good to know. Giblet
Yeah.
information. I
There
like
you
it.
go.
But yeah, my dad used to give me that bag of raw giblets, and I used to sit out back and sort of snack on it.
What? I thought you were going to say you were going to like read the future in it, and like I was
Nah.
soothsaying as a kid.
No, it was like I just chowed down on the sloppy meat. It was
Well, it's
bits and pieces of things like that. And my dad he gave me all these sort of like quite intense books to read when I was a kid. So when I was 10 years old, my favorite book was On the Beach by Neville Shute.
wow.
Which is, yeah.
So was there a moment where you're like sitting at the back, reading on the beach, eating raw chicken liver? That's wild.
Yeah, and I was just like, no, this seems authentic. This is fine. So yeah, sure, why not?
So is that like, I mean, it's not quite microbiology, but was that the beginning of some kind of process? You've obviously narrativized that as part of your journey. Is that a kid who thinks for herself, I guess?
Yeah, I was so I grew up in an alcoholic household, so a lot of the wiring that I developed when I was young was related to sort of resilience and survival and being able to handle shit, you know. And I, because of my sort of obsessive nature, I sort of, yeah, I like a bunch of stuff, but one of the main drivers, I think, towards me becoming a microbiologist is when I was younger, I developed this sort of weird fear of vomiting, emetophobia, and that translated into an obsession with it. You know,
Interesting.
I was completely obsessed as a child with learning about the physiology of it, the neurology of throwing up, all that kind of thing. And eventually that brought me to learning about pathogenic organisms like bacteria and viruses. And as a little kid, I sort of developed this quite in-depth understanding of bacterial toxins and all this kind of stuff. And I was so frightened of them. I was so frightened of getting sick from them. And I also felt like it was super, super unfair that they were trying to make me sick. And like in the last 5 years, looking back, I can identify that as the point at which I really started having a relationship with microbes. I call them the smalls. It's sort of like a flippant way of referring to them.
Oh, so I have a question here. Why the small world? Because It's a Small World After All is a song from my childhood, like a little a toy cat that I had that would play it. And I woke up this morning thinking about that. And we're going to be talking about the small world. So I call them smalls because I was going to ask you why the small world, and we're getting to it.
Yeah, it's You know, my honest answer is I have no bloody idea. You know, it's kind of serendipitous, and I was a smart kid, you know, not like smarter in any particularly sort of savant kind of way. I was just nerdy and bookish and curious, and I went to university and got a bunch of degrees and got my PhD and all that kind of stuff, but it never necessarily felt like this is what I'm made to do, this is what I'm supposed to do. I just kind of like floated along because it was interesting and challenging, and the more I learned about the microbial world, the more there was to learn, and that was really appealing to me. So while I definitely think I was meant to end up studying the smalls, I couldn't really tell you why. You know.
So my cousin is an astrophysicist, and she's back in Western Australia now, but like in Oxford, and she went through her whole high school and university and multiple degrees and so on. She can't answer it either. And it's funny, it's actually very similar, because it sounds the opposite, right? Like it's the bigs rather than the smalls. But her specialty is radio telescopes. So she doesn't get to use all the cool well, she can use them, but she doesn't work with the cool, sexy telescopes and the satellites taking pictures of stars. She has like dot matrix printouts of waveforms, right?
Yeah.
And she can read that as space. And so it is actually kind of, in many respects, you have cooler pictures than she does, but it's sort of the same thing. You're in relation to a world that you cannot see, which is kind of cool.
It is absolutely the same thing, and is is a big aspect of what I talk with a lot of my students is, you know, this, when people are sort of drawn towards relationship with the smalls in any way, it becomes very obvious very quickly. This is an entire universe that you really didn't have much knowledge about beforehand. You probably didn't even realize it was there. And it's very kind of esoteric and mystical and kind of scary and edgy, but it's also entirely contained within the same realm as us. You know, to access it, you can access it immediately. And also, we as human people already have very, very established relationships with that universe, whether it's through disease or through baking bread, but also ancestrally, you know, in terms of our human ancestors, but also the fact that they themselves are our ancestors. And then you start with that, and pretty soon you end up thinking, you know, freaking out about your sense of self and the dark matter of the universe and all of the stuff that we don't know. And so part of the reason why microanimism is kind of frustrating but also super fun at the same time is that everybody's just sat around going, well, this is cool, but I have no idea what's going on.
So was there ever a stage in like childhood where little Siv wanted to be a police officer or something, or was it going to be science the whole way through? Like,
I think I wanted to be a vet at one point.
So the mediums.
Yeah, right. The sort of alive things.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, there are lots of parts of my sort of situation and personality when I was growing up that are very vivid to me now. And then other aspects of it where I'm just like, oh, bugger, I don't know. And it might just be because I was so intensely sort of focused on just survival a lot of the time. And so the things that are vivid now are maybe more pivotal moments or things that really, really had an impact. But I'm sure at some point I wanted to do something normal. And I did want to do normal stuff for quite a long time. I ended up as a college professor, and I sort of only bailed on that a few years ago. But that was never what I was going to end up doing. You know,
yeah, sure.
On paper, I was a pretty good scientist, and I did everything that you're supposed to do in academia, and I've got grants and I've published papers and all that. And so superficially, I guess I was very accomplished, but I was, just a few paces to the left, no, not to the left, to the right of what I was supposed to be doing in the way that I was supposed to be engaging with the microbial world, I think.
Yeah, so that's really interesting to me, because the next sort of section I want to talk about is going from microbiology to microanimism means that you had to encounter microbiology and see its value and interest, but also see its shortcomings, because it's essentially a description of a dead or complete world, right? So to kind of progress into microanimism, you have to see the good and the bad in how academia is in relation to the smalls. And before we get to that, though, because I think this is a useful kind of like pre-history of microbiology, you sort of mentioned the ancestral things, and it's one of those questions you can answer in literally any way. How long have we been, and by we, I'm basically talking about Europe. No, I'm not, because my examples are all non-European. How long have we been in relation to this world that, which is a different way of saying how long have we known that the microbial world exists? Because as far as I can tell, there are praxes and beliefs and attitudes that we can find in agriculture and ritual and so on around the world that demonstrates an awareness of what we call the microbial world. So take that wherever you want. Like, give us the prehistory of microbiology.
I love this question because it kind of highlights this adorable aspect of human scientists, where we just sort of have this wonderful capacity to dramatically misunderstand what it is that we're looking at. And like, I guess the first official introduction between humans and microbes would have been Leeuwenhoek, which is, I think he made his little microscope in the 1700s, 1800s. I'm not great at history, but he saw microbes under his microscope, and he fantastically misunderstood what they were and named them animalcules. And that's sort of like the beginning of the story of microbiology as a subdiscipline of biology. But this is sort of a lovely question as well, because you can see very clearly here within the sort of concept of microanimism how you can use very, very old ideas to frame new concepts in science. And so we as humans, in a more sort of visceral sense, have been in relationship with the smalls since the beginning, the very, very beginning, and clearly through disease, through our own microbiome, through agriculture, like you say, fermented foods, making bread, all these types of ways. And my ancestors, who were all sort of Viking-y, Pictish, sort of shouty, fighty people, it's likely that they had some stories and some conversations about mushrooms, maybe, but they probably didn't have similar stories and conversations about bacteria or viruses or prions. And so this is where you can really start to discuss this idea of nature being a continuum. Like, does it matter that we only just figured out in the last 100 years what a bacteriophage is? Probably not, because we've been hanging out with them for a really, really, really long time anyway. And in that sense, microanimism is trippy, because you can come at it from a really, really highly resolved perspective, or you can just expand it to the planet and beyond, to the void.
That's what I think the smalls are really good at. I think of Alan Savory's work around holistic management, where you're not going to get microbiology right if you can only encounter and come to an awareness of it on a holistic level rather than like an individual microbial thing. Because the examples I'm thinking of, like Amazonian shaman Davi Kopinawa said that one of the many troubles with deforesting the Amazon and putting in monocrops, he said that like the trouble is that the mango and the cashew tree don't know how to call the rain. And that's what happens in areas where we monocrop. You actually do change rainfall patterns. Now, a similar thing happened, speaking of Alan Savory, around the 20th century speaking of New Mexico, actually. They were moving, I think it was the Navajo, I can't remember, but someone told the farmers who were trying to create new conservation land, we'll get rid of the sheep. He's like, well, don't get rid of the sheep. The indigenous perspective was, don't get rid of the sheep. It's better for buffalo, but if you get rid of the sheep, you will alter the rainfall and we'll get drought. And that's indeed what happened, because the having ruminants on a brittle landscape is how you keep the microbial life in the soil through the summer. And it's that kind of exhaling process that changes the conditions to allow for rain. So around the world, and I think about indigenous Australian landscape management, and when the British first showed up, and people don't think this about Australia because its soil is so ancient, but walking around what is now Sydney, they said it was like walking on sponge. And it was these sort of 10,000 years of soil management, which is a microbial intervention that allowed for that, which, by the way, 10,000 years of soil management, we managed to destroy in 2 years of running sheep on it. So a foot of soil collapsed to rock in 2 years of not getting it right. And so that's what I've been sitting with in the lead up to the what we call microbiology is, obviously, because we're going to discuss microanimism, much too small, and it's, as you say, you're either looking at an individual, well, not an individual, but a collection of organisms in a microscope, or you're talking about the whole world and how we are in relation to it. Because this is kind of what I think around the world, even if we don't have words or haven't historically had words for a soil biome. And again, that's a description, that's not a discovery. We knew it, and we knew the disastrous consequences of not being in right relation with it. And that's why I think it's a fascinating, the smalls have much to teach, put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. There's a lot going on in this train of thought. I mean, there are lots and lots of flaws with the way that academic science is performed. Like I'm a real brat about it. I've got a real chip on my shoulder. But you know, fundamentally, our technology and our methods for examining the microbial universe from a biological perspective are inadequate to find out what we really, really want to know. You know, even, I mean, you can sequence the bejeebies out of anything now for comparatively small quantities of money. But what are you really doing? Because if you go outside and you say, all right, I want to sequence this soil biome, you go outside and you collect a handful of soil. So the picture that you're painting is of that handful of soil, right, at the exact moment that you picked it up. But it's not, because you're going to take it back to the lab.
Yeah.
So the biome has changed again. And while the biome is out in the wild doing its thing, it's extraordinarily dynamic and extraordinarily reactive. And it changes from second to second according to the vagaries of what's going on at any given point in time. So there are an awful lot of big discoveries that are made in science with a capital S that make very, very definitive statements about what it means, but that's inaccurate, right? That you can't make these definitive statements. And also this idea, you know, the impact that microbes have, science tries very hard to put things into neat little boxes. So is something alive? Is something not alive?
Yeah.
You know, that's a good one. We've got all these features for what makes a thing alive. And then you look at viruses and they're not alive technically. But if you look at the like overwhelming, inconceivable impact that viruses have on different species, on plants, on biogeochemical cycling day to day, I'm not sure how you could argue that they shouldn't be included on the tree of life.
But also, like, if you have the several trillion viruses in your own virome, like, you're alive. So is Siv alive excluding her virome?
Yeah, I mean, this is like, is a virus just a notion before it finds a host cell to collide with and infect? It goes back to this, you know, very fundamental idea in animism, and what I mentioned earlier on is that nature is a continuum. Nothing is really separate from anything else. So if you're going to look at the virome, then that means the virome is everything. And that's,
yeah,
you know, that's true anyway, because the entire planet is just a dilution of viruses. You know,
100%. And it's, as far as I can tell, where life came from. That's where, like, what I have two vectors of my interest in the smalls, and one of them is directed panspermia, and the other is permaculture, right? So 100%. So how did that, like, is the way we talk about the next bit, do we want to go back to the history of microbiology? Because microbiology has the same problem every other kind of imperial discipline, particularly in the 19th century, did, which is this machine universe industrial model. And we get a whole bunch of wrong-headed ideas out of that into biology and into medicine and agronomy and the rest of it. And is that the same as your journey? Like, when you're encountering microbiology, how did you find the animism first, or did you find the shortcomings in microbiology? Do you know what I mean? Like, how did you solve for it? Did you come in with an awareness of the world as a collection of living beings in formation rather than formed, or did the smalls teach you that by demonstrating the shortcomings of the discipline that is used to describe them?
Honestly, the route that I took to getting to this spot was an absolute mess. It was an absolute mess. When I was younger, a younger scientist, I was an asshole about it. I was like, no, science is the be all and end all of it. You're doing a PhD in script writing. Sorry, no, that's my PhD is superior to your PhD. Right.
You're all in clown college and I'm doing a real thing.
Exactly. I was young, right? And I grew out of that quite quickly when I moved through academia. Really only, I'm 37 now, so really in the last 7 years is when I found out about animism, became a ritualist, started working as a student under the tradition that I work with now. And quite embarrassingly, even after I started practicing animism, ritual, whatever you want to call that, I didn't even think to work directly with the smalls until maybe a few years into it. And now I'm pretty sure that there's a reason for that, which is that I just wouldn't have been able to handle it. I'd have gone down the rabbit hole of my own consciousness and just ended up as a mess and not getting out of bed. It's kind of the same thing that I had this really intense dream once, and it involved some of the deities that we work with in our tradition, and it just felt so aggressive. It was just like huge, and it really freaked me out because I felt like I'd pissed somebody off. It was the whole projection thing, and I spoke to my teacher, and my teacher said, look, those are deities, they could be having a pleasant chat over a cup of tea with you, and to you that is going to feel like a tornado because they're just bigger than you. And that's something that you find, and I've found as well, when you start dropping in with the microbial world and pulling at those threads, it can feel huge. Like, it already feels so edgy and so ancient. But if you rush into anything, if you haven't earned your chops, then you're going to come a cropper as well. But this in particular is so big and so profound and pervasive. And I think that very few human beings have made a direct connection with the smalls. So it's kind of like you're knocking on the door and there's this whole universe behind it, and they suddenly turn their attention to you and you're like, oh, okay. Like, I'm just gonna hang out here for a bit and maybe I'll try knocking again another day. It's so when I started, I started working with animism for a few years, and then I started thinking about the microbial world, and I had to be very gentle with myself and very kind of cautious about approaching them. But yeah, I definitely started off with the hard science, and kind of now I'm moving more towards the mysticism of it, but there's a lot of friction, in that Venn diagram of the hard science and the sort of esoteric stuff, and in the middle I'm just sort of sat here like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm doing.
Yeah, well, if you knew what you were doing, it would actually be the old way of thinking. So
exactly, yeah. So I'm cool with it.
You need to just be present for it. That's, you kind of alluded to it before, which is that in the sort of materialist microbiology or microbiological framework, we have very useful techniques and applications of techniques. There's microscopes, et cetera, right? We'll just use that as the example. But that is separate to the premises or truth claims of like materialist naturalism. So I like your work kind of reminds me of Dr. Monica Gagliano, which is like, well, how do you do actual science in a living universe? And if you knew how to do that now, it would be old science. It would be the old framework, because at least the one thing we know for sure about how to do it is that we don't know how to do it. It's to be present for it, and that itself is a cornerstone of the epistemology.
Yeah, and I think one of the big problems that academic science has is having genuine integrity. There's a real lack of integrity around trying to be a career scientist, and there are plenty of people who are trying really hard to do a really good job at it. But if you're a young scientist and you're just getting into it, you're not allowed to just be driven by curiosity. You have very specific goals and things that you need to achieve, otherwise you're booted out of the academy. So yeah, there's lots of challenges with being a scientist with a capital S. And now, I don't have access to a lab now. And I was a professor for a few years, and I basically answered emails for a living. So now in the last couple of years, I've been focusing on the work with microanimism. I feel like a much better scientist now. And it's really, it's a gift. It's a real gift.
Do you think a dissatisfaction with the academic process was what led you to look in the direction of ritual and animism in the first place? You said that was about 7 or so years ago, obviously. Or was it a series of dream events? Like, how did you find the magic, so to speak?
I, like a lot of people, I realized quite quickly that I've been a practicing animist for most of my life, and I tried to fight it, and I tried to kind of fill this little mold that I had in my head of what I was supposed to be. But even when I was a PhD student, postdoc, whatever, I can remember very clearly developing relationships with bacteria, and every microbiologist does. Every microbiologist develops this weird sixth sense where you walk into the lab one morning and you look at your bugs and you're like, oh crap, the pH is off, just by looking at it, and that perception comes from somewhere. So when I figured, I learned what animism was to begin with, I was like, oh yeah, okay, sure. And I really started thinking about it because I was doing a lot of work on myself, and I was beginning to feel like more of a spiritual person, or whatever word you want to use for that, not to be all sort of new agey about it. And I spoke to a friend who was, had trained in a lot of different sort of paths and traditions. And he said, well, the first thing you need to do is get right with your ancestors. And that's how I met Daniel Four and started doing that work, and then kind of developed from that point. I had a lot of stuff that I needed to deal with in myself, lots of issues of self-esteem and projection and all that kind of stuff. And the message was very clearly, no, you've got to handle your shit first. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and then everything just kind of, lots of things were offered to me, and my job was to make good decisions, have good character. And so for the first 5 years, my practice, regardless of the rituals I was training or anything, my practice was very, very focused on have good character.
Yeah.
See if you can deal with that to begin with. And then it all sort of fell into place through there. So yeah, I'm very much a novice in terms of ritual and sort of ritual technology and things like that. But my path to getting here has been, it's been a lot of work, and it felt unkind at times, but the power of reflection, it's been a really important journey.
No, definitely. And there's novice, and there's novice who's done all that lineage repair, going through like Daniel's system, because that is a lot of work, and your life is different at the other side of it.
Oh yeah, it was it's tumultuous. And I think a lot of students who I've come across kind of, they don't expect it to be easy, but they're sort of taken aback by what actually happens, and
Yes.
how personal it is. There's a framework, there's a very effective framework that you can work with, but ultimately you're kind of on your own. And you got to be receptive, have good boundaries, listen to other people's boundaries, all that kind of stuff. It's deeply challenging work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, all right, so we've kind of done. Anything else we want to say about microbiology before we talk about, and I'll get you to define microanimism, because I think we've got the sort of imperial cosmological route in, and we've got the discovery of animism that comes together for microanimism. Or is there anything else we need before we go there?
I don't think so. I think if something needs to come up, it will.
I like it. So what the hell is microanimism?
Well, that's a word I invented, and it just means microbial animism. It's I'm a simple person.
I like when you first emailed, because I'm very much in the right relation model from a health perspective. So the shamanic energy medicine training I'm doing at the moment, Dr. Violdo says the universe turns predatory. There's no evil in the universe, but it turns predatory when we're not in right relation. So the goal is to be in right relation with the jaguar or the microbe. So neither of them see you as lunch, right? So there's a sort of perspective of, and when you email with microanimism, I'm like, that's it. That's what we were talking about. I love that idea of it, because it's an urgent call to, like, it's not unreasonable to say the future of the planet is at stake to get back to right relation. We only have, what is it? The FAO says we've got like 40 years of topsoil left. This is serious now. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is serious. And you see a lot of signatures in the microbial world of equilibrium trying to bring itself back in, because I always picture the microbial world. I'm a very visual person, so when I drop in with them, it's just like a hive, but it always seems to me that they're striving for this sort of dynamic equilibrium. They're incredibly resilient. So if somebody comes along and flicks their nose, they're like, whoa, but then eventually they'll bring themselves back into it. But their baseline is shifting. in the same way that every living thing's baseline is shifting at the moment in response to ecological disaster. But you can see signatures in the environment. For example, in the Ganges River, there are lots and lots of microbes that have evolved ways to clean up highly polluted aspects of the river. So heavy metals, arsenic. In Chernobyl, there are bacteria with siderophores that are going to eat up molybdenum and things like that. So bacteria and fungi, by their very nature, are bioconverters, right? So they're very, very good at taking this stuff and doing something with it. Like, they don't just exist in these hostile environments. They thrive in them. You know, microplastics in the ocean, like, pick something and I'll tell you a microbe that eats it. The problem that I'm beginning to see there, problem from my perspective, we'll say, is we're seeing an awful lot of science and an awful lot of folks talking about how bacteria, fungi, whatever, are going to solve all of these problems. You know, we can use these bacteria to clean up oil spills, all this kind of thing. And it kind of irks me sometimes because it seems like there's a shift of responsibility there. You know, it's like, yeah, they can do it, but they do it very, very slowly, and they're doing it in response to a survival mechanism. They're not there for us. It's not like some sort of benevolent effort on their part to bring the world back into balance. They're doing it out of necessity. And so sometimes I feel like we're kind of placing a responsibility on the shoulders of people that aren't us, that aren't human. You know, there's a lot of social, political, like all of these things. You can't just say, "Oh, you're going to chuck a bunch of bacillus at it and they'll eat it and it will be fine." So yeah, that's
I like that, because that's techno-solutionism. That's my endless critiques. One, the environment doesn't exist, so, which makes environmentalism a problem. But the techno-solutionism of that is the old thinking. It's not a living systems thinking, because we're not only just corralling this other person, this small person, into cleaning up our literal shit, but we're doing it in a decontextualized way for them too. So it's all well and good to say that we have observed microbial life, as you say, like processing, transmuting, responding to I just said environment doesn't exist, but I'm going to use the word environment, an environment that is toxic. But it is the same thinking that toxifies an environment to say, I'm going to put this one organism on top of the toxicity. If microanimism or animism in general is anything, it's it's humility. It's like this is relational, this is communal. I'm not in charge, and I don't actually know on an individual basis what's going on. I will never, especially when it comes to the microbial world, know. So what way of being and thinking and relating is available that leans into that rather than away from it? So I share your frustrations with the like, oh, we'll just sprinkle this over it and carry on having oil spills. That sounds great.
You see that a lot with lots and lots of different areas here. Things like phage therapy, and it's not strictly microbial, but gene drives to wipe out mosquitoes and things like that. It's they're all sticking plasters, and you're right, they contribute to the problem. And I have tendencies towards misanthropy. You know, I'd much rather hang out with my horse than people. But I actually really like people. I'm not very good at them socially, but I really like people, and I have great faith in their capacity to do spectacular things, which is why it's so incredibly frustrating, you know, when you see a brilliant young scientist say, "It's all right, I got it figured out," you know. I'm just gonna feed that cystic fibrosis patient a bunch of pseudomonas phages to cure their infection, and it's fine. And it's like, you're introducing something into a closed system with like incredible evolutionary pressures, and there's no application of long-term thinking. But again, that feeds back into this idea that people don't have the patience for long-term thinking. And also, like you say, you know, 40 years, we're running out of time to have the luxury of long-term thinking here. It's really sort of reducing an incredibly complex set of issues into something that is a lot more palatable. It's the same thing as sort of making my mum feel guilty for not recycling her plastic bottles or something. You know, like if my mum does that or not, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference to climate change. Like, she's not the problem, bless her.
Yeah.
Like,
Like what Charles Eisenstein would call the story of separation is. So we've got FAO says 40 years of topsoil left, give or take, right? Maybe even less. And so it's that same techno-solutionism. It reminds me of like a car being bogged, right? So you're on a wet, muddy track, the car gets bogged, and oh, we're bogged, let's floor it. And it's making you, and that's techno-solutionism. Like, techno-solutionism got us there. Take your fucking foot off the accelerator. And that's my, I think, concern or alarm. At this point, it is urgent to come back into right relation with the microbial or microanimist kingdoms. And so we've recognized the urgency, but that we only know how to do one thing, which is floor it. And that's where it's kind of like the bioeconomalafi thing, the times are urgent, we must slow down. And this is why I really resonate with the idea of microanimism. Like, the solution isn't, well, the solution is there is no solution, right? So it's what I was about to say, the solution isn't at the end of a microscope, but that's not quite right, because there is no solution. There may be intelligence at the end of a microscope, but it's a situating yourself in a living universe. It's a right relation. So, I mean, what was it like the first time you did that? So you'd encountered ritual and you'd become a ritualist. What was it like? Okay, I'm gonna enter ceremony with the microbial world. Tell us about that.
I was nervous that they were going to be really irritated at me for not doing it sooner. The same way that I was nervous about my ancestors being really irritated at me. And when I dialed in with them, I got the same result that I got from my ancestors, which is, there you are. Yeah. It's been a while, like, we were expecting you. And so that was nice, you know, and for the most part, I just kind of witnessed for a while, because I was very conscious of the fact that this was a sort of privileged interaction. The only reason that I was able to sort of do it, I guess, is because I had training in microbiology. So I sort of had an idea of the roadmap in front of me, which I used, and that quickly became quite irrelevant. But the first time I had sort of a quite profound interaction with them, the thing that struck me the most was this sort of telescoping of time, which is something that relates to what you were just saying. You know, microbial time is really, really funny and strange, right? Because on one end of the spectrum, you've got someone like E. coli who doubles once every 20 minutes. You know, you give it a week and it will take over the planet. There'll be more E. coli's than there are stars in the universe with unlimited resources. So in that sense, they grow very, very, very quickly. But when you drop in with this sort of ancestral perspective, you're talking about evolutionary timescales, you know, this incredibly just amazing depth of knowledge and experience. And you kind of just simultaneously are at both ends of that spectrum and somewhere in between, and it's quite disorienting, but very what's the right word, enriching. I think it was enriching for me. I got a lot of perspective from it, and I got a lot of feedback from my experiences as a child. Like when I mentioned that I was I thought it was really unfair that they were trying to make me sick, you know. And the first time I kind of dialed in with that idea, the response was like, well, you know, that's not what it is, right? You know, we're not trying to make anyone sick. It's just we're good at being us, you know. And that was that felt really nourishing too. And that was sort of like the edges of my practice. And then you go a bit deeper and it starts getting even sort of stranger and frightening sometimes as well, because these ones have an awful lot of power to do harm. And that is an important thing to think about when I work with folks who, for example, are suffering with chronic disease, and that relationship they're trying to navigate. It's yeah, I'm hoping that I can build up a community of practitioners or people who are interested in that, who can specialize in these different areas, because I'm, you know, I have my sort of flavor of microanimism, and other people will be drawn to their flavor of microanimism, because we're talking about reconnecting directly with something that's so old that we've already been sort of working with for that whole amount of time. And so there's a lot of baggage to sift through. There is a lot of conflict to figure out around all sorts of things, not least stuff like pandemics and things like that. So yeah, it's I'm still, you know, at the very start of my practice, and I've been doing it for a couple of years, and I'm under no disillusion that I will be doing this for the rest of my life, and I won't get anywhere near to figuring anything out or being anything other than a newbie at doing it.
Sure. And then the microbes will claim your corpse and you'll go back to them.
The microbes make all death productive.
Yes. Yeah. It occurs to me psilocybin counts as one of the smalls. So if people are like, what's down there? I'm like, well, the mushroom. So, you know, there's some, many of us, particularly if they listen to the show, are in a kind of relation with the smalls already if they haven't been. That's a very good example, right?
Yeah, for sure. And when I started talking to folks about this stuff, I thought for sure that a lot of people would want to talk about psilocybes. I was like, oh, I'm never going to be able to stop talking about this. But
I know that.
it really hasn't popped up. It really hasn't been a thing. I think fungi have had quite a lot of human attention for quite some time, and there are a lot of people who have been working with them sort of within an animist framework, whether they realize it or not. So I kind of like, I'm sort of in my little head, it's not really my territory. I don't think the fungi really need for me to do anything with them. They got a lot of people dealing with that. Although, you know, this whole idea of sticking band-aids on problems, like now that Silicon Valley has become interested in psilocybin and things like that, and it's going the same way of cannabis, I think there are, you know, there's parallels there with what's going on. But
yes,
you know,
it's not exactly in the direction of right relation, but that's a good point. I mean, we've been eating mushrooms since potentially we were monkeys, according to Paul Stamets, and there's, you know, nothing to suggest. I mean, it's as good an idea as any. Yeah, and we have been harvesting them and growing them for millennia, not necessarily psilocybin, but in general.
right.
So, point. Yeah, I like that. It's also, I think, I love them, and we grow them on the farm. King Stropharia mostly at the moment because it's easy. I can just leave them underneath the pine tree. They're out at the moment. They're kind of cool. Anyway, hang on, I was going to say something. Oh yeah, Merlin Sheldrake. I remember him. He was in an interview, not actually in Entangled Life, talking about how microbiology and the sort of the industrial model of assuming everything small is pathogenic terrifies me, right? Because he explained in the 1800s they dig up around the roots of oak trees in England and see the fungal hyphae and the sort of the network of the forest, and assume that the fungus was attacking this 1,000-year-old oak tree and remove the fungus from it. And I get chills 150 years later that we were removing the fungus, the hyphae from around the root system of 1,000-year-old oaks because, this is pathogenic. Everything small is a bug. Everything is a beastie. And you think, oh God. And we did the same thing with soil, right? That's obviously from a permaculture perspective. The guy who invented NPK fertilizer decided that microbial life in the soil either had no impact on your plants or actively competed with them for these three nutrients, let's be fair about it. So it's like, well, you can leave them in the soil or you can disinfect the soil, put some NPK in and grow in that. And we grew corn and soy and things very fast, but with like no nutrients in them. But we spent 100 years thinking at least everything down there is bad and it must be eradicated. And that impacted our medicine, that impacted our agriculture. And the one that haunts me the most is I mean, it should be the millions of people we killed with that wrong-headed idea from a nutritional and health perspective. But it's the tree, it's the oak tree.
Yeah.
Like that's
It's
amazing, you know,
brutal.
1,000 oak tree. Yeah.
And it's like, you know, I don't know, my feeling is that it's a really human thing to think that any type of competition is bad as well. You know, it's like the sort of push-pull, which is central to being alive, to existing. And yeah, that makes me think of back in the UK, my grandfather, my mother's dad, was an Anglican priest, the Church of England. He was a very cuddly, snuggly type of Christian, and it was a big shock when I moved to America. But my grandmother was a really avid gardener, and in her yard at the back of the vicarage, which is this big Edwardian building, was a giant ornamental horse chestnut tree. It was just gorgeous, and my grandmother loved that tree. And when she died, they had moved out of the vicarage and my grandfather had retired, but one of my uncles arranged for us to go and see the tree, which in the house had been turned into a B&B at that point. And my family is a mixture of sort of working class, military, kind of religious, kind of not, but very much not earth-centered, you know, none of them are animists or anything like that. But we all just kind of stood around the tree and we kind of put our hands on the tree, and there was obviously a very meaningful connection to my grandmother because she loved the tree so much, and so many of mine and my cousins' memories of childhood were collecting those conkers and being near to the tree. But when I touched the tree, I just had a really tangible sense of the network underneath the roots and the fungi and the bacteria and everything that was going on in there. And coming back to the States and sort of feeling bummed out and going out into the desert, which is about as far removed from the south of England as you can get, putting my hand in the soil and still feeling that connection. You know, the bloody Atlantic is in between us, but you can still get a sense of that connection, and the fact that it doesn't matter if it's soil, doesn't matter if it's air, it doesn't matter if it's the ocean. It's like everybody is kind of linked arms, you know.
Yeah.
And that's available and accessible to me, to have access to that network and just tap in and be like, I need some tree time, guys. How, you know, can you help me with that? It's so powerful and really comforting.
I love it. I love it. And I know exactly what you mean, having lived at a distance from various homelands myself and places that I'm profoundly and continuously in relation with. But you have a hard stop because you've got porcupine business to get on with in 11 minutes. So
really? Already? Oh, blimey.
we'll definitely have to do it again. But tell people about the course that's coming up and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the course I've called Thinking Like a Plague, which is a little bit facetious because I really don't talk about plagues that much at all. But it's the second.
Plagues. Think about that. Maybe you are thinking like
a right.
Yeah.
It's the second iteration of a course that kind of started as an experiment, but it's like 8 weeks long. There's a lesson a week and a community call and all that kind of thing. But we explore microanimism from sort of lots of little perspectives. The idea is there's going to be a second course, which is going to be a deeper dive. So we cover things like microbes being the foundation for all life, because they are. We cover ideas around microbiological dark matter and what we know, what we don't know, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know we don't know kind of thing, which gets a bit terrifying. We talk about microbes and resilience. We talk about microbes and our sense of self, because once you start thinking about the microbiome and the way that it merges with the human body, we really don't have selves anymore. That's also quite freaky. We talk about pandemics and illnesses. And then right at the end, we have a really nice discussion about microbes as our ancestors and our ancestral connections to the microbes. And it's been really rewarding for me to work with people on that. And I'm really grateful for everybody who's participated. There are just some really wonderful people who are interested in this, which is gratifying for me, because I sort of had a sneaking suspicion when I started this that nobody on the planet would be interested in microbial animism apart from me. So it's nice that people are feeling called to it. And it's also nice for me, you know, as a person who's been thinking about microbes for 20 years, to hear the experience of folks who had no experience of microbiology, didn't really know what the smalls were, like what they're getting from it too. So I'm just, yeah, I get a little bit emotional about it.
Oh, that's good. They picked a good ambassador in you, Sib, the Smalls did.
I hope so. Yeah.
Literally a diplomat from the Smalls. I love it. So where do people
on my
go?
business card?
Yeah. So where do people go to find out about the course? And I mean, it's heading into spring in the Northern Hemisphere. So I know a lot of people who listen to the show are doing more and more gardening of late for various fairly obvious reasons. So this would be like a good corollary to that. If you're going to be working with soil and so on, if you're feeling called or invited to commence your spring gardening in kind of like a wider and animist context, might be worth it. But yeah, lay it on us. Where do they go?
So the website is microanimism.com, and there are links to everything there. And you can get in touch with me through that website as well. And then I kind of half-heartedly do the social media thing. It's mostly just pictures of my horse, but there's stuff about.
Hey, we've got some horse goals, so it's fine. Like you'll actually get some subscribers out of that. Don't worry.
Oh yeah, no, like if you want to see pictures of Apollo, he's a Tennessee Walker. He's very sexy. Come on down to Instagram and Facebook, which is also, it's also microanimism. Yeah, so love to hear from anybody who's interested in it.
Brilliant. Well, this is all too brief, but you know, I can't keep the porcupines waiting. So, so thanks very much. I love this chat. I love talking about this kind of stuff, and yeah, good times.